the midst of a ferocious battle between a band of heroes and a minotaur. Our tale begins with a blonde-haired swordsman soaring towards the monster, while a black-haired mage prepares a fire attack from below. The two strikes land at the same time, terrifying the beast into roaring in wrath, but it fails to slay our heroes. The beast appears to be far more enraged than before. It immediately targets the swordsman, who just manages to avoid its huge axe blows. Just as the minotaur lowers itself into a defensive position and prepares to charge, it looks like it's planning to charge straight into the third member of the group, a young white-haired sorcerer who has been watching the fight from a distance this whole time. The mage turns and warns him to dodge, but the boy, named Kyle, smiles in response as a chill breeze begins to blow around him. There's no way she was telling him of all people to dodge, especially knowing what he's capable of. An ice shard forms in his hand and grows into a long lance that he throws straight at the minotaur, stabbing it through the chest. The monster shatters in defeat, and in a second, the fight is over. That was almost too simple. His two companions rush to him in concern after the minotaur falls. He thinks they're worried for no reason. After all, they already know just how skilled he is. There's no need to stress when Kyle can easily care for himself. He asks them if they still don't trust his skills, and the two freeze in response. It wasn't like that, obviously, but they were just concerned for their master. Kyle smiles at his two companions as they look away in embarrassment. But then his eyes dart to the ground once he remembers just how far he has come. It's hard to believe that this is how he is now, especially considering that the Kyle Saltarian of a few months ago was nowhere near this competent. He was once a spoiled brat facing an imminent death and spending his last days laying in bed as a weak child. Just 3 months ago, in the annex of the Saltarian Marquis, the building's maids gathered to listen to the complaints of one of their own who was charged with taking care of Lord Kyle. She can't take it anymore since there is not a single day that passes by quietly without the brat getting angry and yelling. Today, yelling wasn't even the end of it. The spoiled kid threw things around and even managed to hit her with something, causing the spot to swell. She didn't want to go into his room anymore. But what can they do since they're the ones in charge of bringing his meals and medicine? It may be fruitless since he never eats the food that they bring, but it's their job, and there's nothing they can do about it. One of the maids wonders if the reason for his attitude is because he is the child of a mistress. That comment was a step too far. No matter how much they dislike him, he's still a child, and even the other maids don't like hearing that about him. They warn her to watch her mouth, while the other maid fights for someone else to take care of Kyle. It seems like no one wants to do it since everyone hates attending to him. That is until one of the younger maids volunteers to take his food and medicine to the troublemaker. Her name is Ursiel, and the other maids look at her as if she just grew a second head. She takes the tray with his stuff on it and heads to his room while the other maids watch on. Is it going to be okay for her to go there like this? This is the first time the younger girl has ever volunteered for anything. Hopefully the young master won't hit her as soon as he sees her. Well, there's no turning back for her now, especially as she stands in front of his tall door. A bead of sweat runs down her cheek as she steps through the two massive doors that close off his room. She calls out to him as she steps into the room with his food. But there's no response. Inside, the lump on his bed breathes silently and doesn't answer the young maid's calls. With no sound to signal that anyone is awake, she lets herself into the room and walks through the mess of broken cups, torn books, and damaged furniture to place his food on his bedside counter. Now that she's in his room, she finally sees a mop of white hair peeking out from underneath the covers. He's been sleeping this entire time in this room filled with chaos. Well, before he wakes up, it would be best if she took a moment to clean the place up, so he doesn't get hurt by all the glass on the ground when he finally wakes up. As she turns to leave the room and get some cleaning supplies, a hand snatches hers in an instant before she can react. Kyle is now fully awake and grits his teeth while staring down at her. He demands to know who she is and why she's in his room. The young maid fearfully reveals her name and reminds him that he had once saved her. Then she apologizes for entering his room without permission, as she didn't realize that he was sleeping. Kyle only grips her hand harder as he repeats the name in confusion, causing her to let out a yelp of pain. It seems like he had gone a little bit too far, and that pushes him out of his sudden anger at her. He releases her hand and apologizes for his sudden outburst, and thankfully, she's still all right despite the pain in her hand. Kyle seems to be in a daze after waking up as he shakily glances around his messy room. What on earth is going on, and why is this kid in a maid outfit? He notices the medicine and meal on the countertop and asks about it. Urziel confirms that it is his medicine and meal for the day. However, his porridge has gone cold, so she would need to go warm it up and bring it back for him. With that, she leaves, and Kyle is only more confused about the whole situation. Did she say that was his medicine? And what in the world happened to his body? He carefully steps down from the bed and walks to the nearest mirror to look at himself for the first time. Is that what he looks like? This can't be. This is the face of a video game character, not him. The one inside the body of Kyle Soltarian was not Kyle at all. He ruffled his hair in panic as he stared in the mirror. Lee Hyun-woo, a popular game streamer from another world, had somehow teleported into the body of a character from a game he often played named Fantasy Defense. At that moment, he realized that he had somehow woken up in another world. The character Kyle Soltarian is a video game NPC that appears in his favorite game. He is the youngest son of the Soltarian Marquis family, which is known for their swordsmanship. As one of the characters from the Soltarian family, he was involved in many early game events. In events where he interacts with the protagonist of the story, he always gets properly beaten, and he's usually defeated in a single blow by a minion-level monster summoned by a villain. In summary, he's not even part of the main cast of NPC characters. He's an absolute extra role. That kind of character is who Lee Hyun-woo had awoken as. He decides to test if he's dreaming by pinching himself in the cheek. The immediate pain and the red bump on his face afterward proves that he, in fact, is not dreaming. This was all real. Now that he is sure that this is reality and not some sort of twisted dream, he continues to stare at himself in the mirror in exasperation. How could this have happened to him? Lee Hyun-woo, who was once the #1 player in the Fantasy Defense World Rankings, has now become an insignificant and worthless character. Fantasy Defense is a virtual reality game that will become a hit globally by 2030. Thanks to its devilishly difficult levels, no one had cleared it even after 10 years of it being released. On top of that, it was devilishly fun, and its addictiveness continued to grow its popularity. In the game, there were scores assigned based on gameplay style and quest achievement on a global ranking scale. The scores rise significantly when rare quests are completed, or rare items are obtained. And the person who stood on top of it all after investing 10 years of his life into the game was Lee Hyun-woo, the most popular streamer for the game. He knew rare magic circles and legendary combination formulas that others didn't. He was truly the living dictionary of the game, and he had overwhelming scores that no one could ever hope to beat. And for someone so great to be possessed by such a weak and useless character can only be a cruel twist of fate. This is a game where even the protagonist with exceptional talents can't clear the higher levels. So how is he supposed to survive? More than that, since he has replayed this game so many times at this point, he already knows the fate of Kyle Soltarian very clearly. The ultimate goal of Fantasy Defense is to stop the forces of darkness. The one who summoned those dark forces was Adolf, the second son of the Soltarian Marquis family. The second son was aiming for the position of head of the Soltarian family, and he hoped to use dark powers to incite a rebellion. In the end, the entire Soltarian estate falls into ruin and becomes a base for the dark forces that have been eyeing human territory for a long time. In the midst of all this chaos, Kyle Soltarian, who was completely powerless, was slaughtered mercilessly by those same forces. Maybe if he just leaves the estate before the rebellion even breaks out, that would be enough to keep him alive. That's just a temporary solution, though, and the real problem lies elsewhere. This new noble body of his is suffering from a disease called hermimum. It's a disease that blocks the mana pathways in the body. In this world, mana is the source of aura and magic, which are both essential for survival. Mana is as important as blood in the body, and those affected by hermimum have blocked the pathways in their body, which means that they fail to receive the nutrients needed for survival and growth. That typically means that they die before the age of 20. The only treatment for hermimum is to absorb the mana from the natural environment in order to overcome the disease. However, since the pathways are blocked, they cannot accept mana, and this hermimum is pretty much the same as having a terminal illness. Kyle Soltarian was diagnosed with this terminal illness at a young age, and he has been filled with despair ever since. The fear of death, the anxiety, and the despair over the limited time he has left loomed over him like a shadow, and because of that, his personality became twisted. Before he knew it, he became a disgrace to his family, and his father ordered him to stay in his room and reflect on his actions. There, he continued to boil in rage at the thought that his family thought he was a joke, and someone who could easily be taken advantage of. His anger at the world and at everyone in it grew and grew until he eventually died. In other words, the guy was hopeless. Even in the game, it was always clear that he was a hopeless character. Even though he was a terminally ill patient, his horrible personality is the main trigger for people to give up on him. To summarize the situation, our boy now has possessed an incredibly hopeless character who has no talent or ability for either swordsmanship or magic. No lifespan left, a terrible personality, an awful reputation, and to top it all off, he is confined to his room by the head of the family. This is like starting nightmare mode on a new RPG game. From the start, he is already ruined. Whether he stays put in his room or tries to escape, The inevitable ending for him is death. How is he even supposed to survive in this world with those kinds of stats? Isn't it normal to get at least 1 or 2 cheat skills when you get reincarnated? It would be better if he at least had some kind of status window or something similar. As he contemplates what led him to this situation, bright blue orbs begin to shine around him. Just a moment ago, there was nothing like this in the area. Just where did this come from? The young noble reaches out carefully and touches the orb, which causes a burst of light to shoot out from his hand. Once it clears, a status window with a few key messages appears in front of him. He had awakened, and because of that, he will now receive 2 new talents, which include access to a status window and the mind's eye ability, which will be activated automatically from now on. As if it were summoned by him, the status window appears right in front of his eyes and shows the current stats of his new body. He has 2 new talents called Mana Pathways and Mind's Eye. What could Mana Pathways be, though? Well, for starters, Mind's Eye allows you to see the detailed specs of people and equipment around you. Mana Pathways, however, is a completely new talent that he had never heard of before. Judging from the name, it seems to be related to magic in some way. But magic talents are supposed to be under the Mana Companion talent. Even though he has never seen this talent before, his gamer intuition tells him that this talent is somehow superior to Mana Companion, and it might even be a top-tier talent. When he had the Mana Companion ability, he was never able to see anything like the orbs around him with his own eyes. This is pure mana energy itself, and if his guess is correct, he should be able to absorb it for himself. The noble reaches out his hand and touches one of the pure mana bubbles in front of him. Immediately, he does. He starts to feel the mana flowing through his body. It moves through his arm until it stops abruptly. It seems like this is one of the symptoms of the Hermamum disease. The blocked pathway stops the mana from fully going through his entire body. He was so close to feeling mana flowing through his body, and this was not going to stop him. Through sheer will alone, he starts to force the mana to move through the blockage by force. Through his command, he wills the mana to pierce through the blockage and force its way into the rest of his body. He makes the mana as sharp as a needle, then pushes it against the blockage, slowly pushing through until finally, he starts to feel the mana flowing through his body. It's only up to his elbows for now. But if he continues to gather mana like this and push through each blockage the way he just did, then he'd be able to overcome Hermimu as well. Thanks to that, he will not die, and there will be hope for him after all. Back in the kitchen, Ursula has finished warming up her master's porridge. She has to hurry up and bring it back to him before it gets cold again. As she prepares to carry the food back up to meet him, a group of maids walks up to confront her. They tell her not to give that food to Kyle and stand blocking the door to the kitchen. Ursula looks at them a bit confused as the maids continue to explain that, as a protest to Lord Kyle's misdeeds against the maids, they have come together and decided to temporarily stop serving him. If he goes hungry for a few days, then maybe he will change his mind and his attitude towards them. So they order her to put the food down and comply with them. Ursula, on the other hand, can't be bothered with their protest. She tells them to do whatever they want to do while she continues to do her work. That response doesn't go well with the maids at all. One of them yells at her in anger to at least pretend to be nice. With that, she slaps the meal tray out of her hands and onto the floor. She asks if the young maid still thinks that she's some kind of mobile. She came from a ruined family and was sold into slavery, so how dare she talk back to her fellow maid? Ursula ignores her yelling while the other maid holds the angered one back. The young maid couldn't care less about the ramblings of her co-workers as she continued to clean the spilled food off the floor. That only angers the woman more, as she raises a hand to slap the child who was kneeling on the ground to clean up the mess. Just then, the door swings open, and a blonde-haired man walks into the room. The angry maid's hand freezes in midair. Everyone is shocked by Mr. Leonhardt's presence in the kitchen as he angrily demands to know just what exactly is going on in here. The other two only look at him in shock as he passes them to look at the mess on the floor and the younger girl struggling to clean it up. He sighs once he realizes that these two are just giving the young girl a hard time. The meal for Lord Kyle is already late, and she needs to hurry up and prepare another one to bring to him. Ursula accepts and leaves to go prepare another plate of food, while the two maids stand shyly to the side. Leonhardt turns angrily to them once she leaves, and it's clear that he's not impressed by what he just saw. Meanwhile, Kyle continues to look through his new abilities in the status menu. If he were to utilize Mind's Eye and Mana Pathways together, then it might even change the fate of the Marquis household, which was doomed for a gruesome downfall. He has been playing this game for 10 years at this point, and he has an advanced foresight level of information. Moreover, he was born with the great power and wealth of a nobleman. With all these things on his side, then it might actually be possible to stop the forces of darkness from taking over. It seems like there are big things ahead of him. But first, he has to overcome his Hermimu by opening the mana passages and learning magic. Mana Delay, for instance, is a talent specialized in magic. With his new talent for magic, it would be better for him to become a wizard than a knight. The second thing he has to do is prevent the downfall of the Marquis family. Since he's part of this family, if the family does well, then so will he. The Marquis of Celtrian will be a very solid support in terms of reputation, skill, wealth, and everything he could possibly ask for. Since the territory is located in the outskirts, he doesn't have to worry about the situation in the capital. Finally, and the most important thing, he has to gather talented allies in order to prepare for the massive darkness attack that he expects to happen in the near future. If he were to select a potentially talented person and make them his allies, then they would give him stronger power in return. That is how he's going to build his strength. However, firstly, in order to gather talent, he needs to look around for someone close by. Since he is the Marquis of Celta-Leon, then he would have to start with Leonhardt, who was once a useful tank NPC while he played the game. As he continues to think about what he will do, a girl's voice calls out to him from the door. It's Ursule, who has returned with the food she went to prepare for him. His eyes widen as he sees her, and he realizes that this is the kid that came into his room earlier, although he can't seem to remember her name. She silently walks back to his counter to prepare his food and medicine while he struggles to remember. Suddenly, the status window pops up with exactly the information he needs. It classifies her as a low-ranking enemy and shows detailed information about her stats and her talents. Her characteristics are being cold-hearted and hard-working, but it's her talent that catches his eye. She has a talent called the Spirit's Eternal Friend. That's the highest level talent in the spirit magic category. He continues to stare at her stats until she turns to look at him and realizes that he has also been staring at her. She nervously tells him to enjoy his meal before stepping back to allow him to eat. Kyle watches her intently and wonders why someone with the talent to become a genius psychic is working so hard as a maid. Well, the answer to that happened a year ago at an auction. The auctioneer proudly introduces today's special item as Kyle sits in the crowd bitterly. She points the spotlight at a young girl who stands silently on stage. It's Ursule, and she's revealed to be the daughter of Baron Helheim, who was recently stripped of his title. Because she comes from a noble family, she's polite and smart, and the crowd is clearly interested in her. Thanks to that, as soon as the bids start, people begin to yell out their prices for the young girl. Sir Leonhardt, who is seated beside Kyle, suggests that they leave the auction since they should not stand for things like slave trading. Kyle, however, instead stands up and places a high bid of 300 gold. The price is so insane that the auctioneer stutters for a moment as he hears it. The knight beside him calls out to him in shock for even thinking of buying a slave, but the young noble shuts him up with a word. He will spend his money however he wants to. In his mind, his actions don't matter since his own father doesn't even care what he's doing. Then, with the crowd completely silent from his high bid, he walks over to the girl who looks at him with a blank expression on her face while her hands are shackled. He tells her that from now on, she belongs to him. Now that he had bought Ursule, he took her outside and released her shackles. With that, she was free to do whatever she wanted. He sets her free and tells her that she's no longer a slave now that he has bought her freedom. Kyle turns to leave with Sir Leonhardt by his side, but the girl calls out to him again. She thinks about it for a moment. Now that she had her freedom, she could go wherever she wanted. But since he said that he owns her, she wants to go with him. Kyle scoffs and tells her to do whatever she wishes. Back in the present, Jianwu realizes that he has just gotten a glimpse into Kyle's memories. With that, he understands how the young maid had gotten into the Marquis household. Ursule had been sold at an auction, and Kyle had bought her in order to set her free. She must have been through so much at such a young age. Either way, the fact that he also has Kyle's memories shows that he had completely merged with him. He can even feel the emotions Kyle had toward Ursule at the time. A sense of solidarity from both of them sharing a fate that they didn't choose, as well as their mutual feelings of being abandoned in the world alone. Those were what pushed Kyle to do what he did and buy her. He decides to stop thinking too much so he can enjoy the food in front of him. He takes the first bite, and his eyes sparkle in joy. The meal was delicious. He asks Ursule if she is the one who made this herself. The girl shakily replies that she was the one who had made the porridge. It seems like she's still shy about it, especially since she knows how he can get when he's angry at something or someone. But to her surprise, he instead compliments her on being a good cook and asks her to make the same dish for him again next time. Ursule is momentarily shocked by this and looks away shyly. A status menu opens up over her head and shows that her affection has gone up to 35 thanks to his compliment. Even though she had a bit of affection, considering the dramatic encounter they had previously, her affection wasn't that high. It's not very surprising though, since she must have witnessed all of Kyle's delinquent behavior. The fact that she had any affection for him at all was a miracle in itself. In the game he used to play, there was no spirit summoner named Ursule. That means that in the main game storyline, she was never able to fully develop her abilities as a spirit summoner. And instead, she got caught up in the internal rebellion of the Marquis household, where she lost her life. This time, he wasn't going to let that happen. There is no way he would let such a gem slip away, especially while she's right in front of him. He decides to start working head-on. He asks her if she has ever thought about learning spirit summoning. She looks at him, confused about why he suddenly wants her to learn such a thing. The young noble says he wants her to learn it because he thinks she has a talent for it. She, on the other hand, has never imagined herself as having any talent for spirit summoning. That's probably because she hasn't been exposed to spirit summoning, even in her former household. Spirit summoning is known to be particularly expensive to teach and learn. So for a lower noble family, the cost of education would be a huge burden for them. That just means that he now needs to take matters into his own hands. He tells her that she's going to start learning spirit summoning, and she doesn't have a choice. After all, she belongs to him. Ursula takes a gulp of saliva and looks away shyly as another notification window appears above her head, and her affection increases to 50%. A few days later, Kyle leaves his room and comes face to face with Sir Leonhardt. They stare each other down intently before the snow-haired noble asks the knight to let him through. Sir Leonhardt declines immediately, which only further upsets Kyle. He's been stuck in that room for way too long, and there's a way he was going to stay in that room for the rest of his life. Sir Leonhardt firmly tells him that he cannot leave until his father gives permission, especially after what had happened, and the Lord's last words to him. Kyle freezes for a second, and his mind wanders over all the arguments the Lord has had with him. The whole reason the room arrest rules were there was because they could no longer tolerate his constant troublemaking. But the more time he wastes here, the less time he has to get the mana particles that are floating around deeper within the house. Ever since he discovered that he could unblock the mana pathways by using the mana orbs that appear around his room, he has been absorbing all the particles that appear in his room every day. Although it wasn't enough to unblock the pathways instantly, mana has been accumulating in his body like experience points in a game, and his body gradually improved over time, but it is nowhere near enough to cure the Hermamu disease. To get more, he needed to leave his room and go outside to gather more mana. The young noble promises that he won't go very far, and he'll just walk in the forest nearby so he can exercise. The word exercise surprises Sir Leonhardt, who has never heard such a constructive reason from Kyle. That gets Kyle a bit upset, but Sir Leonhardt continues, saying that he has been tasked as the noble's personal knight for years, but this was the first time that he had ever heard him say something like that. It was at that moment that Kyle realized just how much of a delinquent he had been up until then. He had absolutely no credibility. Even with that, however, Leonhardt seemed to be some kind of unyielding wall. This man was tasked to be Kyle's personal guard, but originally he was a famous character in the game who was known to have a large amount of both defense and offense. He's highly skilled and has great potential, which means he could be raised up to the rank of captain. However, most players simply made him serve as a tank in their parties. Furthermore, due to his high loyalty and unbreakable trust, he was one of the most popular companion characters among players. In the original game, he becomes a wandering knight after the fall of the Marquis household, which allowed people to recruit him through events. For now, though, since the Second Son's rebellion hadn't happened yet, he was still in the Soltarian mansion, working as Kyle's personal knight. It was such a waste to task such a promising talent like him with babysitting duty. Just what exactly were the Soltarian knights doing? Why on earth would they stick him in a dead-end place like this? He accidentally said that last part out loud, and Leonhardt takes offense after misunderstanding his words, as the delinquent is dissatisfied with him as a guard. The younger boy tries to explain that he's not dissatisfied with him, but Leonhardt instead just advises him to follow the orders of the Lord, his father. That's when Kyle realizes that the knight's loyalties don't lie with him. They lie with Lord Rempton Soltarian, his father. That was only natural after all. Who would want to stick with the delinquent younger son? He just can't accept that, though. His next talent recruiting project starts with Sir Leonhardt. He asks the knight if he would be willing to try to persuade his father. The blonde man realizes that something has changed about Kyle's demeanor. Little does he know that in actuality, he has caught the interest of the younger lord, and now the kid is determined to win his loyalty. He pushes a bit harder and asks if the knight will help him. Leonhardt isn't convinced, however. Here's something different about him somehow, but he just can't place his finger on it. He asks Kyle what he's scheming by acting so differently. That shows just how much he doesn't trust the delinquent. The kid has just been in his room for so long that his thoughts have changed. From now on, he has decided that he wants to live a long life. That shocks Leonhardt, who knows exactly why someone like Kyle can't live a long life. The white-haired boy is someone who had to give up everything because of his incurable Hermamu disease. Someone like him saying they want to live a long life, especially when it's unlikely that he will live past 20, was saddening to hear. He didn't have any magical talent, nor did he have any special swordsmanship skills, and by being the youngest, he also has no chance of inheriting the family. Even with all this, Lord Rempton decided to keep him by the child's side. The older nobleman once asked Leonhard if there was any resentment for that decision that practically stagnated his career. He immediately answered that it would be an honor beyond words for someone in the Siltarian Knight Order to protect a direct descendant of the Marquis family. He plans to fulfill his duties faithfully as a man of loyalty. It's exactly because he was such a loyal man that Lord Rempton wants him by Kyle's side. In the Marquis household, there is no one else that can be trusted to protect him. No one except the trustworthy and loyal Leonhard. With that, the elder lord entrusts him to take care of the son of the house. The knight plans to obey that order till death, even as the child now pesters him for a chance to go outside and exercise. He continues to ask if he can go out and even suggests that the blonde knight tell the lord that he just wants to exercise. Leonhard puts down a firm hand to stop him from moving anymore. He doesn't need to go outside to exercise, especially since he can exercise indoors as well. With no other choice, Kyle decides to try a more aggressive approach. He warns Leonhard to move aside and not to let him repeat himself. All he needed to do was go outside and find some more mana cores so he could keep working on clearing his mana pathways. He gave Leonhard a serious stare, and Leonhard felt a strange aura coming from him. Once again, he kept on getting this feeling that something really was different about Lord Kyle, but even so, he had to stand his ground here no matter how much the young lord had changed overnight. He took a step forward and stood more confidently in front of the boy. The Marquis's order is absolute, and this applies to the young lord as well. However, if he really wanted to go outside, then he would have to get past him first. All of a sudden, Kyle felt a heavy killing intent flowing from the knight. It wasn't fair for Leonhard to use killing intent on a child over just a request to step outside. If he were an ordinary 13-year-old, he might have wet himself in fear and collapsed on the spot. Luckily for him, he was not an ordinary 13-year-old. He smirked despite the overwhelming aura coming from the knight, and calmly walked past him and punched on the shoulder. This shocked Leonhard, who stood motionless as the child walked past him, which meant that he had to keep his word. They went out into the relaxing night, and the first thing that Kyle notices is how refreshing the air felt. It had been a long time since he was last outside, and he took a moment to stretch and feel the air on his skin. Even though the garden was not too far from home, he still felt a sense of freedom as he looked at the beautiful night sky. And more than anything, he was excited by the amount of mana particles flowing everywhere. Now that he had the chance, he was going to devour them all. The young lord runs around the garden, trying to pick up as many mana cores as he can while Leonhard watches. From the knight's perspective, he was running around like a child in a playground, and it reminded him of the fact that Lord Kyle was still a kid at the end of the day. He didn't expect the young lord to be so happy just by going outside. But still, a kid being able to work past him while he was using his killing intent should have been impossible, especially since Lord Kyle hasn't trained in mana or aura, so he shouldn't be able to handle that kind of pressure. Leonhard remains deep in thought and doesn't notice Kyle glancing at him. It's obvious that he's still rattled from what happened, and he has every reason to be shocked. The reason Kyle could withstand Leonhard's killing intent was simple. He may physically be a 13-year-old noble boy who has never been in a fight, but mentally, he's a veteran who has survived countless virtual wars for 10 years in a virtual reality game. Fantasy Defense was famous for its realistic depictions through virtual reality, and thanks to his mountain of experience, he had become desensitized to these life-of-death moments, especially since he had already seen some horrible sights while wading through piles of corpses and being drenched in blood. A little scare tactic like killing intent was too easy for him to break after everything he's been through. After a little more mana gathering, he had gotten enough to be able to clear some more mana channels. Coming outside was definitely the right choice. Leonhard informs the young lord that he will be requesting punishment from the Marquis' order for his actions. Even though he was only following orders, it was still wrong of him to use on someone he was meant to protect and serve. Then he bows his head and apologizes to Kyle for the unnecessary use of a powerful skill on him. Kyle glanced at Leonhard, then told him to pass his words along to his father that Kyle does not wish for Leonhard to be punished. The older lord is shocked when he hears that his son Kyle actually said that he didn't want his subordinate to be punished. He asks once again to make sure that Kyle was the one that passed this message to him. Kyle just didn't seem like the type of person to do something like that for anyone. He also mentioned that Kyle managed to face his killing intent skill, which no normal 13-year-old should be able to do. In fact, Leonhard doubted what he was seeing as well. For Kyle to have resisted the killing intent of an expert knight like him, he must have gained great skill out of nowhere. The older lord then asks what Kyle later did while in the garden, After running around the garden for a while, he relaxed and meditated. Leonhardt watched him in surprise while he meditated in the garden. He asked the younger lord when he learned how to meditate. When Kyle was younger, he briefly learned swordsmanship from his father. At the time, he also learned how to meditate, but he didn't have the talent for it, so he gave up quickly. So he wanted to try his hand at it again. And to do that, he asked Leonhardt to keep everyone away from the area so he doesn't get distracted. After that, he meditated at that spot for a whole 6 hours. The older lord stopped the story in surprise at the thought that Kyle could even meditate for that long. He meditated for a whole 6 hours, not 6 seconds. That kid might have changed after all. The Duke had once tried to teach Kyle the basics of swordsmanship when he was young. He was a descendant of the Seltarian family after all, so he should at least be able to walk the path of swordsmanship. He also hoped that the white-haired child would inherit the skills of the family's sacred techniques. However, that kid couldn't do anything. He kneeled after just a little bit of training and complained that his legs felt like they were going to cramp up. That made the Duke angry at the fact that such a weak person could be part of his family. There has never been a weaker descendant in his family. Kyle had no talent for swordsmanship at all. On top of that, he lacked tenacity and patience, and he couldn't even endure simple training. So to hear that someone like that actually meditated for 6 hours is unbelievable. Could it be that something had hit his head and changed his personality? Leonhardt already thought of that, and he checked to see if there was anything wrong with his food. Fortunately, there was nothing unusual, and Kyle's sudden change was entirely on his own. His personality had completely changed recently, and it's not just his attitude towards hard work that had changed. Even the way he looked at Leonhardt had clearly changed as well. It seems like he has finally started to mature a bit, and that is something that interests the Duke. He decides to let it go without more discussion and tasks Leonhardt to continue taking care of Kyle. Back in his room, Kyle continues to channel his mana until his spiritual vision is enhanced and his mana starts overflowing. Thanks to that, his eyes can now accurately access the state of his own body. With that, he should be able to clear the mana pathways all the way to his heart in one go. He starts in his arm, then he pulls the mana into his shoulder, down to his spine, and then finally, all the way to his heart. He endures the pain as his heart frees up. But after a moment, he opened up his mana pathways and freed up a path to his heart. Now that he has done that, he should be able to use magic, and he's excited to start learning magic in earnest. In this world, to use magic, a mage has to form a circle near their heart. To master higher-level magic, then they must increase the number of circles they have, and the more circles they hope to create, the longer it will take. So if a person hoped to become a mage, they would have to start training between the ages of 5 and 8. Then, by the age of 12, they should be able to form at least one circle to be seen as a person with the potential to become a mage. Since Kyle is already 13 years old, it's a bit late for him to start learning magic. Luckily for him, he wasn't a normal NPC who had to follow the simple rules of their world. Since he has the mana adaptation talent, then his case is different from normal. All he needs to do is form a circle, and he should be able to start learning magic. But first, he had to learn how to form a circle in the first place. Maybe he could build it the way he learned from the game. As he pondered on how he would do things, a knock came from his door. It's Leonhardt, and he came to pass on the news that the Duke has lifted the restrictions on Kyle's movement. Now, he's allowed to leave his room and take a walk in the garden under the condition that Leonhardt accompany him at all times. He still can't leave the estate, but being allowed to walk in the garden is already a blessing for someone who spends every day and night trapped in his room. It seems that Leonhardt really did a good job convincing his father, but it also seems like his favorability had increased as well. It had increased by 30 points out of nowhere. Back when he repelled the killing intent, his favorability was at -50. Maybe he was moved by his meditation in the garden, especially since he meditated all through the night and collapsed in the morning. Leonhardt seems like the kind of person who's impressed by sweat and perseverance. Either way, now that his restrictions have been taken off, there's a place he has been wanting to go. The estate's library is a place filled with all the knowledge he would need to form his first magic circle. But the librarian doesn't look happy to see him. In fact, she looks terrified. She rushes over to Leonhardt in a desperate attempt to find out what's going on. Kyle was banned from entering the library a long time ago after he had spent an entire day tearing some genuine, rare books that would cost a fortune to replace. He used to joke that they were just pieces of paper that were useless after you die, even though she struggled to get them after traveling across the empire. After his outbursts in the library, he was banned from ever stepping foot in there, but it seems like his restrictions had been lifted. Kyle himself is embarrassed that he used to do such foolish things, but now he only came to the library to read, not to cause trouble. He specifically wants books related to magic. That confuses the librarian since the Duke's family always emphasized swordsmanship, so there weren't many books on magic. For now, all he wants is a book that teaches how to form magic circles. She brings him an introductory book that seems way too complicated for his liking. There were books made for 7-year-olds, but each one felt like a university thesis. Normally, if this was some sort of game, then there would be a status window that would allow him to automatically learn everything in each book. As if on cue, a status window appears in front of him and informs him that he has unlocked a skill called spiritual vision. It allows him to translate the low-level book that he was struggling to read and then turn it into simpler copies that he can read quickly. On top of the translation feature, he can also use his sharp perception skill to decode books easily and quickly. He asks Alice, the librarian, for more beginner books, and he's excited to gain as much knowledge as he can. Leonhardt wonders if it is really okay to have these many books borrowed out at once. The librarian was really worried that he would damage some because of the sheer number that he borrowed. Even selling her house wouldn't be enough to replace them if they were lost or damaged. She didn't need to worry so much about it, though, since he planned to finish them quickly. Or at least he would lose interest in them halfway. Normally, Kyle hated books, but now he's eagerly reading as many as he can, all at once. Leonhardt notices that the books he picked out were mainly books on mana management and magic circle formation. He quickly figured out that this must be related to his disease. He tries to give a little bit of advice to the young noble about how learning magic will be difficult since Hermimum blocks the mana and aura flow of his body, but Kyle already knows what he's trying to say before he even starts talking. Leonhardt offers to back away if his advice is unwelcome, but that's the opposite of what Kyle is thinking. It's a valid point after all, so there's no need to get upset about it. Everyone in the house would probably say the same thing and see what he's doing as a waste of time, but he's the black sheep of the family after all, and he already has a reputation as the reckless youngest son. A little bit of weirdness from him wouldn't surprise anyone. Besides, it's not like reading books harms anyone. At the end of the day, he's sure Leonhardt is just worried that he will fail at learning magic and then fall into a deep despair. But that's quite the opposite. Kyle has no intention of dying young. He stands up and walks towards the older man, then places a closed fist on his chest to reassure him. He's planning to do everything he can to make sure that he survives longer than anyone thinks he can. With that, he leaves to find a more comfortable place to lie down and finish his book. Leonhardt is left stunned at Kyle's sudden personality change. The Kyle Seltarian he remembered wasn't this strong-willed in the slightest. One of his earliest memories with the kid was a day in the training field where he kneeled down on the ground, crying for his father. When Leonhardt came to ask what was wrong, he told him that the older lord had said that there was no need for a kid like him. He used to be such a crybaby once, and now it looked like he was growing into someone admirable. The blonde knight picks up a book and heads towards the kid, and that's when Kyle notices that his affection score has gone from -30 back up to 0. He has no idea why that happened so suddenly. There was nothing special that he did that should make it jump up so suddenly. He's almost scared as the older man approaches him, but all he does is place a book on the table before leaving and offers to wait outside his room. Before the older man left, there was the faintest sign of a smile on his face. Kyle wonders if maybe he just liked seeing the younger boy read. But if that's the case, then why didn't his affection level change while they were in the library? Well, he usually likes seeing persistence, so maybe reading multiple books in one go counts as persistence? Regardless of the reason, Kyle simply chalked it up to him being a strange guy. All the while, Leonhardt stood outside his room with a wishful smile on his face. Now that the older knight is gone and he's all alone, it's time for him to start reading. He activates his sharp perception skill again and starts decoding all the books he had borrowed from the library at once. As he expected of the skill, the decoding speed is dozens of times faster than his regular reading speed. Not just that, but he can also decode multiple books at once, so it was like he was reading all of them at the same time. On top of that, any difficult parts of the decoded content were broken down into simpler data. The knowledge from the book also gets stored in his brain as data. The more books he reads, the more knowledge he gains, which then speeds up the decoding process even more, which increases his comprehension. That then speeds up the decoding process even more. Within a matter of minutes, all the books in the area had been decoded. With that done, it's time to put his magic to the test. The first thing he wants to try is forming a circle using the decoded data. Thanks to the decoded knowledge, he already understands the basic principles of circle formation and the minimum conditions to form a first circle. First, he has to guide the mana along a golden trajectory so he will be able to form a circle. He sits down and prepares to start forming the circle, and with a little bit of concentration, the mana begins to move along the trajectory. Immediately, it starts to feel like his chest is burning near his heart, but he has to endure. Otherwise, the mana will flow backward and damage his organs. He struggles with it, and after a long, agonizing process, he manages to form the first circle. Thanks to this, his blocked pathway trait has been weakened. This means that his mana has become more active, and he was one step closer to beating his terminal disease. He can now collect refined mana within the circle, and with that, he should be able to use magic properly. However, he had spent the entire night reading and trying to form that circle, so as soon as he stood up in celebration, he collapsed in exhaustion. His last thoughts as he started to drift off to sleep were if Leonhard and Ursiel were going to nag at him for sleeping on the floor. Later in the morning, Ursiel comes into his room to bring him breakfast, and sees him passed out on the floor. She rushes to his side to try and wake him up. She was confused about why he was out cold and what all these books were doing in his room, despite the huge toll that the process was taking on his body. It's impressive that he had managed to successfully form the first circle in just a single night. From now on, a new life as the mage Kyle Siltarian was beginning. Meanwhile, Leonhard returned the books to the librarian, who looked like she was on the verge of exploding from stress. A delicious-looking tray of food sits in the kitchen while Ursiel puts the finishing touches on the last piece. After lots of hard work, her meal is finally done. She blushes while remembering the compliments Lord Kyle gives her whenever she cooks well for him. The thought of getting more compliments from him makes her smile as she grabs the plate to go deliver it to him. On her way out of the kitchen, the maids that once harassed her come over to block the exit to the kitchen. They notice the food on the tray and know that it's supposed to be for the younger lord. They stare down at her condescendingly and tell her that she should go and rest instead of delivering the food. This time, they want to deliver the food to him personally since they've noticed that his personality has been a lot better recently. Besides, serving Lord Kyle wasn't her responsibility once before, so she can return her position to its rightful owner now and return to their original arrangement. Ursiel declines their proposal. If they have any complaints about her work, or they want to change it, then they can just talk to Lord Kyle themselves. With that, she walks past them while they call out for her to stop, but she ignores their calls and bumps into a blue-haired maid at the door. This one only looks at her with a confused expression, while the other maid continues to yell at her. They exchange a look for a moment before she walks out of the kitchen to serve Lord Kyle. As she leaves, the blonde-haired maid sends a nasty look in her direction, but doesn't say a word. She delivers the breakfast to Kyle, who digs into it enthusiastically while she watches over him with a smile. She tried adapting the recipe to fit what he had taught her, and it seems like it suits his taste. Her cooking just gets better and better with each passing day. Because of him, she's been practicing hard every day, and she even learned some new recipes from the head chef. She really was diligent and hardworking, and he admired her for that. But his thoughts on her were elsewhere. He asks her how she's progressing with her spirit magic. She freezes as he mentions it and doesn't immediately respond, so he asks her to bring her introduction to the spirit magic book that he had given her once before. She has read about halfway through the book so far, and judging by the worn pages, she has also been studying it diligently. Since she's from a noble family, that also means that she has basic education, and her learning speed isn't slow. However, he's not satisfied with her current pace. They don't have the time to take it slow. He needs her to learn more and become stronger. In 2 months, the Siltarian family will hold the heir succession ceremony. On that day, the second son, Adolf, will lead a coup aided by dark spirits, and the Marquis family will fall. Everyone in the villa at the time will be caught up in the chaos, and Ursiel as well will be caught in the middle, or she'll lose her life. To avoid that happening, she must become stronger. To give her more time for studying, he decides that she will be put off cooking duties for a while. For now, he will just have one of the other maids take over serving him, so she wouldn't have to worry about it. Ursiel immediately refuses his offer and clenches her clothes as tears build in her eyes. She promises to work harder so she can keep studying spirit magic while still cooking for him. That way, she won't be neglecting either of them. While still crying, she begs him not to let anyone else serve him so she can keep being by his side. Her crying face moves Kyle's heart. It seems like she wasn't considering her feelings at all. Her family had collapsed in an instant, and she went from being the daughter of a baronet to a slave, then finally to a maid. She even lost contact with her family and has no idea if they are alive or dead. Because of that, it makes sense that she would be heavily insecure about her life as a maid, especially since she is only just adjusting. So far, she has only been able to live a somewhat stable life thanks to his help. And now he wants to change all of that for seemingly no reason. It makes sense that he would be confused by all this. She must have thought that if she couldn't perform her duties as a maid properly, then she would be locked out of the mansion. That must be what she's thinking since he never explained the situation properly. Now that he has taken the time to consider her feelings, he decides to fully explain the situation to her. First, he reminds her of what he told her when they first met, and he brought her here. He told her that she belonged to him, and he never abandons one of his people. That means he will always protect them. The young maid is taken aback by his words, but he keeps going, explaining his reason for asking her to learn spirit magic as well. She's an excellent maid with incredible cooking skills and a diligent and meticulous work ethic. If she were to keep working hard like this, then she would surely be promoted to head maid. However, there are plenty of other maids in the mansion besides her, which means that there are plenty of people who can replace her at any time. Her face changes to an expression of fear, and she tries to plead with him again, but he cuts her off by placing a hand on her shoulder. Then he asks her what would happen if she were to become a spirit mage. Spirit mages were rare and respected mages, which means that if she becomes one, she's bound to become a great person in the future. Everyone will look up to her, and she will become the greatest spirit mage that ever existed. Her mind begins to daydream about adventures they could have with her as a spirit mage, and Lord Kyle by her side. By then, there would be no one in the world who could replace her, and she would be with him for as long as possible. She still seems insecure about whether she can pull it off at all, but Kyle assures her that she can easily become the greatest spirit mage. With his confidence as her drive, she takes the book from his hand and agrees to become a spirit mage just as he wants. At the same time, her affection for him goes up by 10 points, and she pledges to trust his judgment on her. After that, he officially appointed Urciel as his personal maid, which gave her a fancy bow. From there, she began to handle his personal affairs, and he also moved her out of the shared maid quarters into her own private room. That way, she'll be able to study, and she won't have to worry about clashing with the other maids. She seems more excited by the fact that this room is close to his room than for the added security, though. He hopes that with this, they will be able to work together and grow strong together. After a while, she settles into her new room filled with books for her to read. While looking through her vast bookcase one day, she notices Kyle and Leonhardt walking through the courtyard. Kyle notices her looking at him through the window and sends her a wave and a smile. She giggles and leans against the window while watching him pass by, while her affection increases to 65. Meanwhile, reports of Kyle's change in behavior reach an unexpected individual. It seems that news of Kyle's change has reached a lot of people. Recently, they've noticed that he has been exercising a lot more often and building his strength. On top of that, he doesn't snap at people as often, and he has recently been dedicating a lot of his time to studying magic. It seems like somehow his personality has increased greatly, and he has finally grown up somehow. It seems like it was finally time for Adolf Seltarian to pay a visit to his once foolish younger brother. Urciel waves back at Kyle as he passes by. He turns to Leonhardt and asks him to prepare a wide open space that's far away from the sight of other people. There's something he wants to experiment with in that space. He's hoping to try a magic experiment. His mind goes to a place in the outermost part of the estate where no one is likely to see them. The place is surrounded by a dense forest of trees, which makes it hard to see anything from the outside. That makes it perfect for the experience the young noble plans to practice. He instructs Leonhardt not to let anyone get close to them. Then he stands in the center of the field and prepares himself to unleash a spell. Leonhardt watches him from afar with a bit of doubt in his mind. Lord Kyle has never been able to use magic or practice swordsmanship due to his Hermamum disease. Reading a few magic books over a couple of days isn't going to change that fact. However, the current Kyle might have a way to break free of those limitations somehow. The white-haired noble prepares a ball of magic in his palm, then sends it out as a magic missile towards a tree. The spell explodes in a bright light and immediately destroys the tree on impact. Leonhardt and even Kyle himself are surprised by just how powerful the spell was. The tree slowly falls over to the side as the two of them watch while shocked at the output of power he just showed. Kyle immediately turns to Leonhardt and asks if he thinks the sound reached the mansion. Thankfully, the knight managed to use his aura to suppress the explosion. That means that they wouldn't have heard the sound of the falling tree as well. His fast reflexes managed to save both of them from some very uncomfortable questions. While that is definitely nice for both of them, there's a bigger question left to be answered. When and how did Lord Kyle form a magic circle? Kyle responds that he formed it not too long ago after following instructions that the book from the library said. Somehow, with those techniques, he managed to tap into his blocked mana. Since he had successfully cast magic and formed a magic circle, that means that he had now overcome his Hermamum disease. To show more proof, he summons a magic orb in his hand and shows it proudly to Leonhardt. At that moment, the promises that the young lord made flashed through his mind. He said that he would do everything he could to cure his illness, and he had no intention of dying young. Somehow, he had actually managed to pull it off. Leonhardt had felt something different about the white-haired delinquent once before, but he had no idea that this was it. He warmly congratulates Kyle on his accomplishment, and his affinity increases by 10 since he has started admiring the kid. That's to be expected from a man of perseverance. He is easily impressed by people who achieve things based on their hard work. However, there were still several questions to be asked, like the fact that he had only formed the first circle, and the power he just showed is definitely more than a simple first circle spell. The power of a first circle spell is usually just about the same strength as a punch from an adult human male. but the blast he sent out had the power of a fourth circle spell, which is way more advanced than any spell a beginner should be able to cast. Despite that, though, he's still a first-level mage, which makes his ability to cast such power spells even more incredible. Could it be that Lord Kyle is actually some sort of prodigy? No matter how you look at it, though, this power is just way too noticeable. Thanks to his mind's eye ability, he was able to read all the first circle magic books in the library. If it weren't for that skill, it would have taken months to successfully form a circle. The skill also decodes that magic is used differently from how he remembers in the game. According to the magic books, he had to draw a complex magic circle to be able to use magic. Then, after going through a bunch of difficult equations and calculations, he then had to activate the circle by circulating the mana. The process is longer and much more old-fashioned than what he remembered from the game. In the game, all he had to do was draw a simple magic symbol with mana, and then it would activate half away. This method was way easier to use and a lot more powerful than the complicated methods he had to learn. On top of that, he had also learned all the magic symbols in the game over the long amount of time he played. Since the methods were way too complex for his liking, he decided to use magic in a more user-friendly way, like he did in the game. But the end result is way more powerful than he thought it would be. If anyone found out about just how strong he was with these techniques, then that would be a problem. It's not time to reveal his full strength yet, and it'd be better if he kept it a secret. He asks Leonhardt to keep what he saw today a secret, even from the head of the family. Leonhardt is confused about why he would want that, causing Kyle to try and convince him by making a cute face. That only makes the knight's affinity drop instead. So instead, he decides to tell Leonhardt the reason he wants to keep the strength of his powers a secret. It's because of the succession ceremony in 2 months. It's a very important tradition in the Marquis family that chooses the next successor. The successor is not chosen by age but through a competition. All their traits are judged at once, including their personality, wisdom, public support, and other factors. All these things are used to determine who was the most promising heir to lead the family to greater prosperity. Because of his promising personality, his primary supporters were the family's long-serving retainers. Right now, there are 2 main people fighting for this position: the eldest son, Abel Seltarian, and the second son, Adolf Eltarian. These 2 characters were incredibly important to the story. Abel Seltarian is the son of the legitimate wife of the Marquis of Seltarian, and he was also the most likely candidate for heir. He has a gentle nature and excellent swordsmanship skills, and on top of that, he's been groomed as the heir since childhood, and he grew up with high expectations as a model elite. Then there's the second son, Adolf Seltarian, who was also born from a legitimate wife. He was overshadowed by his elder brother Abel, and that meant he was overlooked for many years. However, at some point, during his growth, Adolf's personality became more composed, and his swordsmanship skills improved rapidly, which caused him to stand out among the crowd. That meant that Adolf's supporters were young and passionate knights. He almost had the vibe of a gang leader, and these 2 overwhelming personalities clashed in a hallway back at the mansion. As soon as they met each other, Adolf sent a deadly glare in his older brother's direction. Abel, on the other hand, doesn't seem like he's bothered at all. He greets his younger brother politely, especially since it's been a long time since they've seen each other. In fact, he was so lost in thought that he didn't even notice the younger man approaching. At least, that's what he says. But for someone who manifested his aura at just 5 years old, it was impossible to believe that he wouldn't be able to sense someone's presence. That was just a story from ages ago, and even if Abel calls it a fluke that isn't worth bragging about, it's still so much better than his brother, who couldn't manifest his aura until he was 15 years old. The older men accompanying Abel joked that the younger brother might just be slow and lacking talent. And of course, some people just tend to start off slow after all. The casual insults are enough to cause Adolf's subordinates to confront the older men in anger, but he orders them to stop. They were in the main house right now, and acting recklessly could negatively affect him. It seems like he trained his followers well, and Abel condescendingly suggests that he might truly be worthy of being a candidate and the heir of the household. Adolf only scoffs at the snobbish attitude of his older brother. As far as he's concerned, Abel won't have any reason to laugh much longer. With that, he orders his subordinates to continue down the hallway, and they walk off while Abel watches them leave with a suspicious glare. Later on, Kyle calls a meeting with Leonhardt and Ursula in his bedroom. It's about the succession ceremony, which is set to be held in 2 months. The ceremony doesn't care about those born by legitimate or illegitimate means. All they are about is their strength, and that means that any direct descendant of the lord of the household is eligible to compete for the position of heir. Well, at least on paper. In reality, there were exceptions to the rule, and the youngest son just happened to be one of them. Due to Kyle's illness, he was excluded from his competitions by default. The third son, Duke, was also not involved in the competition, not just because he is too young, but also because, in terms of his skills in sword fighting and magic, there is no comparison between him and the rest of their brothers. Therefore, the most likely candidates for the position were his two oldest brothers. Neither of them would like any random surprises appearing at this stage of the game, especially since they were so close to the succession ceremony. So imagine what would happen if it became known that Kyle has suddenly developed a strong power at a time like this. He was once seen as a fool who wasn't even worthy of being in their sights. Now he suddenly looks like he's about to rise as a dark horse. There were only two possible reactions to this news. They would either try to convince him to ally with them, or they would go after his head. It seems like a drastic train of thought at first, but history has always been full of bloodshed for the position of heir, so it's not the craziest thought. According to the game's setting, Abel is a fundamentally good person, meaning there was a low chance that he would take the more drastic of the two options. Adolf, on the other hand, is almost guaranteed to try and behead his younger brother. That guy is already set on killing his whole family from the beginning, so there's no way the older brother won't try to attack him if he ever finds out that he has learned powerful magic. Because of that, the only option he has is to overcome his hermimum and become stronger. He may have a promising future, but as the youngest first circle mage, it was fine to either bring him in as an ally, or to suffer no major even if they didn't. Now that he has a more detailed understanding of the situation, he decides to trust Kyle's judgment and keep his powers a secret for now. But as soon as the succession ceremony is over, he will report this matter to the head of the family. Kyle's secrecy seems to be reducing his affinity with the knight, but there's nothing else he can do in this situation. Right now, Leonhardt is loyal to his father, so he can't expect the knight to suddenly side with him. It's not impossible though, and this is already a better scenario than before. Even so, he's already sure that he can make the older man follow him, one way or the other. His unchecked desire is so strong that Leonhardt can feel it. The knight turns back to face Kyle and asks if he is really serious about becoming a mage. The Marquisate of Keltarian is known for their swordsmanship, but it would also be beneficial if he became a helpful mage. The thought of the fact that Kyle will soon make positive contributions to the family makes Leonhardt smile, and his affinity grows by a large amount. Kyle is shocked that it grew out of nowhere, and he has no idea how that even happened. Could it be because they all ate together in his room? That's why the knight was complimenting Ursula on her cooking right after they had their talk. So, in hopes of continuing to increase their affinity, Kyle suggests that they eat together in his room from now on. Leonhardt isn't as thrilled with the idea and suggests that they just eat at the knight's quarters instead. But Ursula is secretly happy about the sudden request. Later on, in the night, Kyle sits on the ground in his room, studying the magic symbols he knew from the game before. These symbols allowed him to activate his magic as fast as possible with a huge amount of power as well. But in this world, he's not able to control how powerful his spells are. It's already difficult to handle as it is, but now he'll have to figure out how to handle it before he can use his magic in public. For now though, he decides to ignore all that and just try to seal the symbols up for now. There will be a chance to show off his magic eventually, but to avoid drawing attention, he will have to use basic magic for now. The magic activation in this world is slow and difficult to learn, but it allows more precise control. Then he gets an idea. Since the magic activation method allowed him to control his magic output, and the symbol activation method allowed him to cast more powerful spells in a shorter time, then he should be able to combine the two and get the advantages of both. He tries to combine them, and the system immediately gives him a warning of a high risk of magical explosion from what he's about to do. The notification window suddenly appearing scared him enough that he jumps back in shock, but it seems like the combination is actually possible. The system asks him if he's sure that he wants to go through with it despite the risks. However, high risks usually mean that he'll get high rewards from it, and he's not going to get anywhere without taking any risks. With that in mind, he starts the process of mixing the two activation methods, while the status window continues to warn him of a danger of magical explosion. Then it asks him one more time if he wants to go through with it, and he agrees to it excitedly. Then, the system starts analyzing his body and his experiences to see if he has the ability to combine the two activation methods. Once the analysis is done, the two spells combine, and he's able to create a new form of magic by combining both his spellcasting techniques into one. With that done, he tries to continue playing around with the spell to see how efficient he can make the spell, until his room starts to crackle with electricity and he realizes a little too late that something is wrong. Ursula walks outside with a pile of towels in her hands. She suddenly hears a large explosion coming from Kyle's room and rushes to see what's going on.